I would like to thank you for being here today, and I would like to announce that you're going to have your own parade at the end. You're going to have the chance to come closer to the tree. So my name is Isabel. I'm the curator at the museum. So this is our third program. It's a monthly lecture series that happens every third Friday of the month. Before we dig into the 16th century, I would like to please ask you to turn down your cell phone. And I have the calendar, September calendar, to share with you for our upcoming events. September 2nd, we're going to celebrate Labor Day at the museum with a free admission for everyone. And we're going to have activities for children and families. September 4th, we're going to have the other lecture program we have. It's the first Wednesday of the month, the brand bag lunch, and we will welcome Holly Lane, docent at the museum, and she'll be talking about the Civil War in Fernandina. September 6th, that's the day that you'll be able to buy your tickets online on the website of the museum for our annual events, the Graveside Chronicles, and it's in partnership with the Amelia Island Genealogical Society. And you're going to have a live actors there. September 9th, that's an event for the member, a patron perks event. It's a special walking tour to the courthouse downtown, and you'll have lunch here at Baker Hall. So you can buy your tickets by calling or emailing Phyllis, who is behind the bar.
As usual.
So if that's for members, if you're not a member, just get your membership. And last one, that will be the next third, and that will be the exhibit opening, and we'll be talking about Fernandina and the railroad, and we'll be hosting John Hendricks, who is the president of the West Nassau Historical Society. So that's it for the next third. Now for this third, we are welcoming Charles Cobb from Gainesville. Charles has been the curator of historical archaeology at the Florida Museum of Natural History for 10 years. And he specializes in indigenous cultures of the Southeast, especially the interactions between the Native American and European cultures. His current research examines the impacts of the 16th century Spanish incursions in the regions. In his presentation, he will offer new insights into 16th century artifacts and how those recent findings through metal detectors are reshaping our understanding of the way of living of Native Americans and their relationships with early Americans. So now please join me in welcoming our speakers. Ciao.
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to give this talk here. And I have to say, I think this is the first time I've given a talk with an open bar. Which I think that's incredibly civilized, and I have to wonder whether having a French curator has something to do with it.
That's just Fernandina.
Yeah. And also thank you for inviting me to Fernandina Island, because I'm embarrassed to stand up here and say that I've been here for 10 years, here being Florida. I live in Gainesville, and I've never been here before. So it's a wonderful town. I've had a chance to walk around, just had some great ice cream and coffee and that kind of thing. And as you well know, I saw you had a talk last week on Spanish history on the island. As you well know, Amelia Island, which is one of my passions, as we'll be talking about Spanish history, has a very rich Spanish history. As you probably know, there are several well-known Franciscan Spanish missions dating to the 1600s on the island. They were excavated by archaeologists from Florida about 30 or 40 years ago. Subject for another talk if you're ever interested. But anyway, Spanish missions are one of my passions. Whoops. But another one is 100 years earlier. what we refer to as the Spanish Entrada period, when Spaniards first started entering what is today the southeastern United States, which they refer to as Florida. I think this is an important period of time because I see this as one of the great transformations in human history. And by that I mean European colonialism. It's, for better or worse, there's certainly a dark side to it, but there were certainly many positive sides to it as well, and I'll be talking about some of that today. But I can't emphasize that enough. You think of the invention of fire, the domestication of animals, and other huge inflection points in human history. I mean, the era of European colonialism literally rewrote the history of the world. And one of the cool things about living in Florida is that history is literally on our backyard, including Amelia Island. So what I want to talk about today is archaeological attempts to get at the first explorations in the southeast United States and how our perspectives and databases changed a lot in the last 20 years because some subtle changes in methodology. But the Spaniards were well aware that there was something here when they were in the Caribbean in the late 1400s, early 1500s. They didn't realize there was an entire continent up here. So they first started their sanctioned explorations in southeastern Florida with an individual you may have heard of, Juan Ponce de Leon, who first landed in 1513. Everybody knows that story. One of the points I want to make about these expeditions, though, is this is not a couple of people on a boat. There's a lot of people, okay, who are coming into Florida throughout the 1500s, most unsuccessfully until 1565 when St. Augustine was founded. So Juan Ponce de Leon, he comes back in 1521, probably lands somewhere around Fort Myers with several boats, several hundreds of people. He's here for only, the records are very poor that poor back, here for maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a month or whatever, and they get driven out by the Indians. Ponce de Leon himself is mortally wounded and dies back in Cuba. And these are just the major expeditions. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just kind of give you a gestalt or a sense of the Spaniards flying across the landscape. So you have Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón in 1526. He lands somewhere around northern South Carolina where Georgetown is, or Winyah Bay, with 600 people on several ships. They find the land not very productive. They split into two groups. The men and the boys march across the land south to Georgia, somewhere just north of here, we're not sure where. And the women and children on the boats, they land and they form a colony for like 3 months. Many people die. And then a couple hundred people end up going back to the Caribbean. Porfirio de Narvaez lands in Tampa Bay in 1528, again with 600 people. He splits into two again. Some people go by boat. They end up getting kind of washed away and going back to Cuba, but about 300 people march up today around what is around Tallahassee. Eventually, everybody dies except for 4 individuals who manage over the course of years, manage to work their way here. In fact, they go further west into the southwest and cut down south. 4 individuals out of 600 people make it back to Mexico. They march back. And we actually there's a document, the individual's name is Cabeza de Vaca, head of the cow. So, but he wrote an account, and to read the astonishment of the Spaniards in Mexico when these 4 guys show up, it's an amazing story. 2 more quick ones. Tristan de Luna forms a colony in what's today Pensacola Bay in 1559. 1,500 people, including a couple of hundred Mexican Indians. Aztec Indians come up with them as kind of warriors. And even so, he settled here for a while, sets up another town in the interior with all those people, moves them up temporarily. 1,500 people living in interior Alabama in 1560. And then finally, everybody knows Hernando de Soto, 1539 to 1543. He also lands in Tampa Bay with about 600 people, wanders across the landscape for about 4 years. He dies along the way, and the remaining, there's about half the people die along the way, and then they come down the Mississippi River, build rafts, and manage to get back to Mexico. Again, amazing story of survival. But the backdrop I'm trying to get across here is there are like thousands of Spaniards who are wandering across the southeastern United States with a lot of stuff that archaeologists are interested in. And so why are we interested in that? Lots will be self-evident, but I'll go through some of the points we're talking about. So we'd like to reconstruct the routes. You saw the map I just showed you with the lines drawn on it. Those are schematic. We only know very broadly where the people went. We have the accounts of people. They're not drawing maps. These are narratives. Traveled 6 leagues yesterday, and 2 days are missed. 3 days later, we traveled another 8 leagues. We crossed the big river. Those are the kind of descriptions you're getting. So we're trying to reconstruct these routes with a combination of historical documents and archaeology. the location of important settlements. There's a lot of important towns, both European and Native American. We like to know where they are because these are important points of history. People have heard of Fort Caroline, right? Everybody knows about Fort Caroline. Been trying for decades to find Fort Caroline. We have no idea where it is. But a very significant French fort built somewhere near Jacksonville that led to Menendez forming St. Augustine to drive the French out. So there are tons of, and I'll talk about some of the important Indian towns that we're trying to find. There are points of particularly important battles between the Spaniards and the Indians. What's the impact of European incursions and explorations on Native American societies, both good and bad? The impact of European diseases or Old World diseases was absolutely horrifying to Native Americans who more or less had been isolated for 10,000 years and didn't have the immune systems to counter a lot of these, what to them are new diseases. But there are a lot of good things. There's a lot of trade that's going on. Native Americans are trading corn to the Europeans. Europeans are trading metal tools and stuff. So it's not all bad, but it's an interesting mix. We're interested in that. And the last point I'd like to make as an archaeologist is a lot of people think of colonialism. Well, the Europeans came, the Indians folded over, slowly disappeared, and they were gone. The reality of the matter is, there were vibrant Native American societies numbering in the tens of thousands up until the 1830s in the southeast, until they were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. So Native Americans were in a very resilient way, assimilated the Spanish presence, the French presence, and English presence, and created very dynamic hybrid cultures that still exist today. And again, this history is all in our backyard. So there's a lot of reasons for kind of tracking down these sites. And so what I want to talk about today is kind of an interesting phenomenon that's happened only in the last 15 years or so. As you'll hear me talk about in a second, there has been intense interest on these routes, where they were, what happened, who met who, and so on. And we know actually incredibly, remarkably little, as I alluded to earlier, about where the routes were and so on. And so what I want to talk about today is archaeological attempts to rediscover these routes, how that's occurred, how it's been skewed and biased, and how it's been revolutionized in the last 15 years by the systematic introduction of a relatively simple tool, and that's the metal detector. Anybody here a metal detector at all? No? Incredibly addictive and very useful for archaeology, as you're going to see. So the first thing I want to point out, I'm going to talk about a skew in our perspectives up to about 15 years ago and why that is. And so the received wisdom until about 15 years ago was, how does stuff that the Spaniards are carrying, how does the stuff get spread a lot across the landscape? And the received wisdom that was believed by historians and archaeologists alike was that there was largely one conduit. And I'll step aside and hold that aside for a second and say there was another. If you're in Florida, there's a lot of shipwreck salvage going on. So we're going to hold Florida as a separate case. I'm talking about the interior southeast here, Alabama, Georgia, and so on. But certainly Native Americans were taking stuff that washed ashore and what have you, European objects, making other things, and so on. But the received wisdom aside from that was that the leaders of Spanish expeditions were making alliances with Native American provinces and towns as they traveled around the landscape. And the way they were cementing those alliances is they were giving them items that were highly valued, had never been seen before by Native Americans. As you saw in my first slide, this is really first contact. Many of these Europeans had never seen indigenous people before. Some had served South in Mexico and South America, but many of the Spaniards were new to North America. Once you get off the coast, Native Americans, this was truly first contact for them. So the received wisdom was that the leaders of the Spanish expeditions, in order to cement alliances, were being extremely frugal. They were taking what's called a gift kit. They would take beads, certain types of celts or cutting implements, bells, things that tinkled, and they were trading them selectively to Native American chiefs, rather than kind of creating an inflationary economy by getting to everybody. And and I have to say that there are two lines of evidence to support that. First of all, the documents say DeSoto was selectively giving stuff to this chief and that chief and so on. And archaeologists were tending to find these things, but I'm going to argue that was bias, but we're tending to find these things of people who we were presumed were chiefs. And so this is important not only for cementing alliances, but because many expeditions, particularly De Soto and also, again, Ayan, who went into the interior here, I mean, they were living off the land. So they came with shiploads of stuff that were just packed to the gills, but they knew that this was a limited amount of stuff. I mean, the weapons they hoped would last them the entire time they were there, but they had like kegs of nails, tons of food. They were Catholic, so you had all the regalia that goes with doing masses and so on. But they knew that this stuff would be fairly limited, so they knew they were going to have to live off the land, and by selectively gifting with chiefs, they could get the food that they needed, they could get additional supplies that they might need off the ground, and they needed a lot of food. Again, think of feeding 600 people moving around through the interior. And by the way, De Soto also had a couple hundred horses, and he had 100 pigs that he was herding through the landscape. They were living heavy off of the land. And they also needed porters, particularly De Soto. Again, De Soto was 1539, 1543. He landed with the mentality at Tampa Bay that we got a ton of stuff. There's no way we want to carry this all. So as soon as we hit the ground, we're going to start capturing Native Americans. So each Spaniard on this expedition was issued a length of chain, and they would chain up Native Americans who they were using as porters, and they're also using the women as concubines. So it was Native Americans, as much as they could, who were carrying tons of stuff, first the Spanish stuff across the landscape, and then as they moved into the interior, they bought massive bushels of corn and that kind of thing. And so, here's the interesting thing. Up until the year around 2010, fewer than 100 of these special gift objects had been found. I mean, these are the only items of anything off all the expeditions that have been found in Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, where we know Spaniards have been hanging out for years with hundreds to thousands of people. So only 100 mil objects. And archaeologists thought, well, that makes sense because they're just selectively handing this stuff out. Okay. The problem is, we're all humans. We'll drop stuff, you leave stuff behind. It doesn't matter if your chief, your boss, De Soto says, I'm going to selectively trade with the chiefs, hang on to what you got. If you're 600 guys who are living in an Indian village for 3 months, if you're overwintering, you're going to be trading your personal possessions for goodies and other things you can get with Native Americans. It only makes human sense. And if you look at the fragmentary records that we have from these expeditions, they were, like I said, they were full to the gills with stuff. We only have a partial inventory of what Tristan de Luna brought when he landed at Pensacola Bay. Again, he had 5 ships, 1,500 people. From the fragmentary records, we know that he had over 1,300 horseshoes. You got to constantly replenish those horseshoes. Horses are critical to what you're doing. Over 1,400 pounds of mule shoes, 68,000 nails and tacks. He had tons and tons of food that were in kegs or casks, and these casks were surrounded by metal. There were weapons, all kinds of stuff. And you extrapolate that to what you really need for an expedition from what we know from some of the other records of the Spaniards landing across the landscape. They had all kinds of tools. Keep in mind, these were expeditions, but they were also colonizing efforts. If they found the right spot, they wanted to be prepared to sit down and set up a settlement, a village or a city or whatever. So they're prepared to explore, but they're also prepared to settle if they needed to. So they had tons of tools, things for growing iron, shovels, hoes, and that kind of thing. They had armaments. They were prepared for conflict. They knew this wouldn't be an easy passage through the southeast. So they had crossbows. They had some of the earliest muskets, matchlocks, and so on. Swords, pikes, horse tacks. Again, lots of horses, bridles, saddles, horseshoes, all that kinds of stuff. All of these expeditions had a number of priests with them, or missionaries. So all of them were carrying religious items with them. All the clothing off all of these expeditions, cooking stuff, etc., etc., etc. So when you start thinking about it from that perspective, it's kind of like that commercial from the 1980s, Where's the Beef? It's kind of like, where is this stuff? I don't care if the stuff was if chiefs were selectively traded with. If you're bringing 100 tons of stuff into the interior, and we know all this stuff is not going back to Cuba when they leave, where is this stuff, So this started to become a quandary, and these are things that's almost embarrassing to get up here and say because it's so obvious in hindsight. that these things had to be out there. The question is, why couldn't we find it? So that's somewhat I want to talk about. So again, this is largely what had been found up to about 2010. And one of the reasons it was assumed to be associated with elites is because these few objects that had been found, fewer than 100, almost always were found with the burials of elites, typically elite males with some elite females. I say elite because they're not behind these items with them, but they have like copper headdresses and fancy pots, fancy weapons with indigenous manufacturing and so on. And then these individuals also happen to get this. So they kind of fit our model. But these typically were burial goods, things that were buried with chiefs. And most of the stuff came from this area, the southeastern United States. Why this area? Unfortunately, this is home. Well, first say DeSoto went through here, recorded a number of large towns. This is in 1540-ish. DeLuna came up 20 years later, recorded a large number of large towns. There are some massive cemeteries, Indian cemeteries, that were discovered in the 1950s and the 1960s. Unfortunately, they were looted big time. So there were collectors, looters, if you will, who had these incredible mortuary collections, largely indigenous goods, but they also had these 100 or so odds and ends of European objects. And eventually professional archaeologists got to look at this stuff. But once archaeologists realized this stuff was showing up in burials, they quit looking elsewhere. All focus was on burials. So it almost perpetuated this story that elites were going to end up with goodies because that's the only place that we were looking was mortuary sites and looking for elites. So we're kind of caught in this kind of cycle, if you will. So I'm going to take a shot of water here. So the story began to change around 2015. And I like to tell you that it was a bunch of us sitting around plotting out this great plan to overturn the received list in the Southeast. Actually, it was almost all serendipity. So in 2015, let me say a little bit before that, around 2010, I started working with the Chickasaw Nation, whose homelands are in Mississippi, but they were forced to move to Oklahoma. I started working with the Chickasaw Nation on a couple of projects. I had some colleagues of mine at Ole Miss and Mississippi State. And so I had several years of kind of good relations with the Chickasaws. And in 2015, they came to us with this can't turn down kind of deal. They said, we are willing to fund your research if you will train Chickasaw kids to be archaeologists, college kids. So we started running a field school every May for a couple of weeks. And the irony is we're training Native Americans to replace us, I guess, which is ultimately the grand irony, which is the way it should be, right? So this program started in 2015. And so Chickasaws came to us and said, what do you think is an interesting research question that you would like to run by us that we also will find interesting, that our college kids are going to be interested in? So we said, something that's kind of interesting is we know that in the 1700s, the homeland of the Chickasaws is in Tupelo, or in the Tupelo region, Elvis Presley's hometown, just centered there. But we think, given archaeological evidence, that your ancestors moved out of an area near the Alabama border, where West Point and Columbus is today in central Mississippi. We think there's archaeological evidence that there was a mass migration out of the Tombigbee River. I think actually that is due to climate change. I think some multi-decadal droughts occurring in the 14 and 1500s. Another talk for another day. And the skimpy archaeological evidence we had suggested that your peoples migrated up to a region known as the Black Prairie for a couple of hundred years. So we think it would be kind of cool to follow that migration if we could, and then look at the kind of the ecological changes they went through as they moved from a floodplain environment to a prairie environment. What sort of shifts did your people have to go through to make that kind of adaptation? And they said, well, that's really cool. Let's do that. And we agreed we would start south and move north. Again, this is 2015. So we decided to start on a site in Starkville, which is where Mississippi State is. It so happens in 2015, before we started our work, that Mississippi State wanted to develop, when it comes to last parcels in Starkville that hadn't been developed. It's this beautiful piece of hundreds of acres of pasture. And because federal monies were going to be involved, archaeologists had come in and they found that there was a major site that probably dated to the 1400s to the 1500s, looking at the archaeological, looking at evidence of the ceramics and that kind of thing. No evidence of Europeans whatsoever, but kind of around right before contact period. So they decided to put that project on hold. And we decided to go out and just start there. We figured this kind of fits the timeline we're looking for. And Brad Lieb, who is the chief archaeologist of the Chickasaw, who's kind of our partner in this, he goes, you know what, you guys metal detect? What the heck? Let's just start, before we start excavating some units out here, some 1x1 meters, just for the hell of it, why don't you bring some metal detectors and let's just walk over the property real quick. Well, you know what? We started working. I'm talking the first day, the first hour, this stuff started popping up, and we were like, oh my God. Now, I have to say that I'm going to be fair to some archaeologists who have missed this stuff in the past. If you look at it and you come up afterwards, a lot of stuff looks like just junk in the field. I had to be trained to recognize that a lot of the stuff is not junk in the field, it's actually 500-year-old artifacts. But a lot of it looks like something that would fall off a tractor or something like that. But anyway, we're finding things like celts, which is another word for an axe, but Native American style celts that are made from Spanish iron, by the way. Barrel band fragments. So this, interestingly, is a highly desired trade item among the Native Americans, where the Spaniards would take, you have the barrel staves of the wood and they have the iron band around it. Well, Spanish forgers would cut them into lengths about that long, and then they would sharpen each edge of them, and these became incredibly popular trade items. Now that we recognize them, we're starting to find these barrel band fragments everywhere. And this is just an aside, it just occurred to me. I came across a report a couple of years ago where some Australians were talking about, this is a report like 100 years ago, were saying, hey, the Aborigines in the area, they really love barrel bands because they're making axes out of them. So, isn't that kind of a cool independent invention kind of thing? But anyway, this is an axe fragment. I'll talk more about some of the stuff we're getting and the retooling that's going on. But again, first day, and our brains were just kind of like, totally did not expect this. And so the question is, why Stark Farms and why in the area of Starkville, Mississippi, would we be finding this stuff? Well, I have to say that archaeologists had always thought, based upon the records as well as historians, that DeSoto had come somewhere through this locality, okay? The general descriptions of topography and so on fit the DeSoto accounts, and there are 4 surviving DeSoto descriptions, accounts. People were on the expedition, and everything described really looks like the Starkville area, but nobody had ever found anything before. And so here's the story of DeSoto. DeSoto arrives, you see here, in December of 1540, and he makes a pact with the local chief. He says, if you'll put us up so we can winter here for a couple of months, we'll trade some of these things with you and so on. In exchange, hopefully you'll feed us. So DeSoto was always going for big towns and big provinces because they usually had massive stores of corn in particular. And the horses wanted the corn, not surprisingly, the soldiers wanted it. So these indigenous provinces had very large surpluses that the Spaniards were gravitating towards. Well, and the history you'll see over and over again as you look at the accounts is DeSoto always stays too long. He always overstays his welcome because he always manages to make the Native Americans extremely irate. In large part because they are such a heavy burden on the resources of the Native Americans. Okay, they're not very good guests. So, in March 4th of 1541, DeSoto announces to Chief Chickasha, who's also the head of the town of Chickasha, hey, we're leaving. We're leaving tomorrow. Thanks for boarding us and everything. And by the way, I'm going to ask from you about 300 of your people for porters. I'm going to insist that you give us 300 of your citizens to take our stuff out of here. Well, in the middle of the night, the Native Americans burned the Spaniards out of the town. And so there's a pitched battle. Not many people are killed on either side. Unfortunately, about 20 or 30 horses die and about 100 pigs die along the way. They get burned. They're keeping them in these temporary stables. But there's a massive battle that occurs. The Spaniards are driven out, and they go about 2 miles away, it looks like. And about a week or so later, the Native Americans drive them out again. So all of the accounts agree they lost a ton of stuff. They lost a lot. They were literally running for their lives. So they're leaving behind literally barrels of stuff. I mean, they were really pretty badly off after the Battle of Chickasha. So one would expect potentially finding, so people weren't surprised when we started finding this stuff. I will say as an aside, we first thought we had Chickasha, which would have been really great, for National Geographic and all that kind of stuff. But we didn't find any things that we would associate with the Spaniards. We didn't find any horse remains. We didn't find any egg remains. And Native Americans certainly were eating these things. So we would have expected, we didn't find that on any site we were working on. We haven't found any Spanish ceramics or that kind of thing. What we think we found was, we think after Chickasha was burned out, the Native Americans in the surrounding area were treating it almost like a mine or a resource. Everybody was coming and grabbing what they could get and bringing it back to the town. So we think we're in the area of Chickasha, but we don't think we're in Chickasha proper. So we're kind of glum. We think maybe that it's sitting under the town of Starkville, which has really expanded extremely rapidly in the past 30 years or so. But maybe not. And so now I'm just going to quickly run you through some of the things that we're getting, and then I'll close with another series of sites that we've been working on. So these are axes, and the thing that's kind of mind-blowing that we haven't been able to figure out is the Native Americans are taking these heavy iron axes, and everybody has seen an iron axe, and they're breaking these things down. And they're trying to maximize them. They're typically trying to get 3 axes or celts out of a single Spanish axe. They're trying to do a cut this way, and with the curved part that holds the staff or whatever, they're actually somehow managing to flatten those out to make one tool, and then they're often cutting this into 2 parts that way, or we see this type of reworking a lot. So these are all axes that have been modified through incredibly laborious work by Native Americans, and we're not quite sure how they were doing it, except they were putting a lot of effort into it. And so they're trying to maximize what they're getting. I mean, like I said, first contact, absolutely unique tools to the Native Americans. And so they're trying to get the most out of these that they can. This is kind of like a who's who of interesting things we're finding. Here's another axe, part of an axe, part of a horseshoe. If you see this little curl right here, it's like a bend break. You can tell where they're moving them back and forth until they snap and you get multiple horseshoes. And on this end or along here, we'll find these things have been sharpened, so they're using them as blades. Everything is getting recycled. Nails, a little chisel, a celt. I'll talk more about this. This is a very interesting celt that they'll have another view of. So we found 2 celts made out of iron and that are exact replicas of stone celts. This is a Native American stone celt that probably dates around 1812 or 1300 or something like that. So when we saw these, we were like, these are exact duplicates made out of iron. And we spent a lot of time talking to blacksmiths, because none of us are blacksmiths, and blacksmiths know this stuff. And they're like, there's no way that you would take a piece of raw, cold iron, raw stock, and work that down. You have to be forging that stuff. So what it looks like is the Spaniards are actually, they're kind of meeting demand, they're meeting consumer demand. They know the shapes and styles that Native Americans want, and this 3 months of living among Native Americans, they're actually starting to create replicas of Native American tools out of iron. This is kind of one of the, I think of these as the more poignant artifacts we've found, because if you remember, I told you that each person on the DeSoto expedition is carrying a length of chain. Well, when you metal detect, let me say, we're starting to find a lot of stuff, but the ratio is like 1,000 to 1. I mean, we're finding, tin cans, and I had it like an ageism moment. Last year I was working with a woman, probably in her 30s, and I said, dang, I found another pop top. She keeps saying that. She goes, what's a pop top? Are you kidding? I just felt like ancient going home right there. Oh my God. Again, we're finding a lot of stuff that's not the real deal. We're finding chain links of all sorts. But this stuff is hand wrought, and this very long elliptical shape is very typical of it early. It took us a while to figure this out. When we first found this, we wasn't sure. But the interesting thing is, some of it's linked, but we also find that when forgers are making this, you have a length of chain, you bend it closed, and then you solder it closed if you will, your hammer closed when you're forging. So that's the weak link in the so-called chain. That's the weak point in the chain. We're finding the Native Americans seem to be breaking these at the forge weld point, and then they're making tools out of them. They're sharpening. We very frequently find these sharpened down for piercing tools of some sort. And we found this just this summer. There was a conference in Spain a number of us went to. We're trying to share the results with some of our Spanish colleagues. And a friend of mine who's working in Georgia on our same timeline, he said he was in Trujillo, which is in western Spain. And this is where Francisco Pizarro is from, the man who's credited with overthrowing the Inca Empire in 1532. It just so happens that De Soto was one of the primary lieutenants with Pizarro, became fabulously wealthy, and this is why De Soto was able to fund his own expedition in North America. De Soto was hoping to replicate and find what his boss had found, some years earlier, unsuccessfully. But so this is actually a monument to Pizarro that we have just discovered, and you see almost exact copies of these very elliptical-looking chains. You would not find a monument like that. It's kind of weird to see a monument with Native Americans chained up like that, but a piece of history for sure. Finding parts of weapons. We found a little cast iron shot. De Soto was carrying 2 cannons around the landscape, 2 portable cannons. We found this is a ramrod tip. Again, the Spaniards were definitely carrying muskets, not all of them, but probably about 100 or so were carrying muskets. The Spaniards were some of the first armies to adopt muskets in the 1400s into the 1500s, which accounted for a lot of their military successes in Europe at the time. We're finding copper alloy pendants. By that I mean typically brass. We can tell that they're taking large brass kettles that the Spaniards are carrying with them, and they're breaking these things down. We even found, these are the stuff that's finished. We found a lot of small pieces of brass that are scored. You can tell before they bend them and break them to make things out of them. So they're making all sorts of little pendants and beads and that kind of thing to presumably hang from their clothing. And this is one of the coolest things we've found on a couple of these bangles, so to speak. Copper and copper alloys have natural salts in them. There are incredible preservatives. So things that are stuck to copper will last hundreds to thousands of years in the archaeological record because of that preservative effect from copper. We're finding some of these bangles actually have intact cloth under them here. So this little item you see here is probably about that big. We're going crazy trying to identify this stuff. There's something called amino acid racemization. We try to get the DNA, but there's no surviving DNA. The people we know who are textile experts say it's such a fine weave textile that it's probably European, maybe something like flax. So we hope to identify this someday soon. If we could, it'd be the first European textile identified north of the Rio Grande River. And so the other thing I want to emphasize is all this stuff we're finding off the Stark Farms site comes from residential context. We have not encountered a single burial on the site. Native Americans don't appear to have been burying people here. This is stuff that had all filtered out into the community in some way. So I think, like I said, I think they're scavenging. I think the Native Americans are trading stuff and so on. And it fits, like I said, it fits in historical hindsight exactly what you would expect if hundreds of Spaniards are carrying tons of stuff across the landscape and dropping stuff along the way or losing stuff along the way. But it's metal detecting that made it possible for us to find this. So we have metal detected equivalent of 4.5 football fields at Stark Farms. We've excavated probably about 30 to 40 1-by-1 meter units, a lot. Excavating, we have found only one European object. Okay? In 2 or 3 weeks of metal detecting, we have found over 100 objects. So the moral of the story is that, it looks like there's stuff everywhere, but of course, as you know, these dots are greatly inflated in size relative to ground surface. It's more like a tiny, tiny pinprick. So if trying to find these things is literally like trying to find a needle in a haystack, even though there may be 100 or so on a site. And they're so difficult to find in these typical archaeological methods, just digging square, digging real slow, screening everything. It's only metal detecting that allows you to rapidly, systematically go across the site and realize in the course of a couple of hours rather than a couple of months that you're standing on a site that has a 16th-century Spanish presence on it. So again, this revolution has really only occurred in the last 10 years or so. I want to say people have metal detected sites a lot in archaeology, but again, it's only in the last few years or so that we started specifically targeting 16th century Spanish sites. So we're starting to have a lot of success. And so what I'm going to close is the latest success story. And I have to say, there's been a lot of reluctance in metal detecting in archaeology because it's associated with looting. So whenever you're metal detecting in archaeology, as an archaeologist, you have to explain to your colleagues why it's okay. So a couple of colleagues and I, this is where we were working, a couple of colleagues and I were working in Alabama, just east of Demopolis, which is south of Tuscaloosa. And they were, as opposed to us who were lucky, they were specifically looking for the DeSoto route, okay? Because they knew DeSoto, we knew generally DeSoto had swept through here and gone up this direction. So they had found scores of sites where the pottery looks like it belonged to the 14 or 1500s. They hadn't found anything that looked DeSoto-like. And so about 3 years ago, they sent around a technical report and said, this is what we found to some colleagues. I circulated among my colleagues in South Carolina who were doing the metal detecting with me. Said, hey, these are the sites we're finding. We think we may be in the area of DeSoto. We're not sure what we're going to do next. We'll keep looking. So we emailed them and said, have you ever tried metal detecting? And they were like, yeah, we heard what you're doing. But then the next day, Jim Knight, the guy who calls me, he goes, see, these are some of the suspicious sites. He goes, okay, walk me through what you do metal detecting. I said, we're not randomly walking around the landscape. We're just kind of looking. We set up these grids. Every person is responsible for like a 20 by 10 meter grid, and we set up these intervening grids. We cover the area 100% with our metal detectors. We have these overpriced GPS units that will document where something is within 10 centimeters on the Earth's surface. We are documenting exactly where everything comes from, so we have the complete context. So he goes, reluctantly, he goes, okay, would you like to come out and help us out? So I said, we would love to. So about 3 years ago, we went out. Whoops. Where are we? Okay. And what he was particularly interested in finding, Jim Knight from University of Alabama, and actually DeMoss from University of Western Alabama, particularly they were looking for a town called Mobilla. Mobilla was an even larger disaster before Chickasha. In fact, it happened about 6 months or so before Chickasha did it. And it's the same story. That DeSoto had managed to irk the Native Americans. There was a massive battle, and the Spaniards had lost, again, a ton of stuff. So he put this sequentially. Earlier in the year, in 1540 in Mobilla, Spaniards lose a ton of stuff. They go to Mississippi, lose another ton of stuff. So by the time they cross the Mississippi River, they have almost nothing left. So Mobilla and Chickasha, I'm talking about finding famous towns. Mobilla and Chickasha are two of the big ones on the bucket list for archaeologists. So these guys really have been wanting to find Mobilla. And so we started day one about 3 years ago, and it's a grad student and me, and it's Ashley DeMoss. And Ashley's metal detected maybe once or twice before in her life. So we go into one of these sites that they're interested in, and Ashley, she has this in her hand. We've been on the site 15 minutes. And she comes to and goes, Charlie, is this anything? And I was like, I can't believe it. It's happening again. It's like we start finding these things. And the interesting thing about these are called the Marengo complex. In Starkville, we found only one site with a ton of stuff. The difference with the Alabama sites is we had found stuff on about, I can't remember, probably 15 or 16 sites that over numerous square miles. Somehow this stuff is getting strung out across the landscape in a very different way than we're seeing in Mississippi. What I think is going on is that I think DeSoto may have passed through this area, lost a lot of stuff, may have traded a lot of stuff. And if you remember me talking about 20 years later, De Luna, the guy who landed in Pensacola, he moved into the interior on the Alabama River and set up a town, or took over a town known as Nanapacana. That's probably only 20, 30 miles from also where we're metal detecting. When they left Nanapacana in 1560, again, this is 20 years after DeSoto, they were under such bad conditions. The Spaniards were starving. Again, there were 1,500 people. They were starving. They were being attacked regularly by Native Americans. They asked for help for who was left at Pensacola. They sent up a bunch of stuff, boats, I should say. They took everybody out literally overnight. And one of my colleagues, John Worth at West Florida. He can read these 16th century Spanish documents. He's an expert at paleography. And he's starting to find survivor accounts from soldiers who were trying to get pension funds and that kind of thing. And they're describing their conditions of that. And they're like, oh yeah, we left everything behind. We left buckets full of horseshoes and so on and so on. So we think that we may be in a zone where we have different waves of Spanish stuff from two expeditions 20 years apart. The Native Americans got a hold of them and just trading among themselves. So these are celts. Some of these are probably barrel band celts. They have the classic shape. This would be about that long and about that wide. For some reason, we are finding a lot of horseshoes. We found maybe 2 or 3 horseshoes at Start Farm. Our biggest site in the Marengo complex area has probably yielded about 15 or 20 horseshoes. Before we started metal detecting sites around 2015, I think a total of 3 horseshoes have been found in all of the southeastern United States. We now have about 25, thanks to metal detecting. Again, they're breaking these things and making all kinds of tools out of them. There's our friend, the chain links have been broken. They're making tools out of them. This is a cartographic divider. See this right here? This is part of what people would be using to measure out distances and angles on maps. So somebody dropped one of these things. This is one of the coolest objects we found. It's a site, I'll show you again, it's the biggest site that again we found. This is a site that's got all the horseshoes. We started finding these brass objects, and there's a trail under here, you'll see, it's all about this big. I'm like, what are these? We saw this little thing, it was like, are they bell fragments? No, it's something that the priests were carrying with them. And we met with some colleagues who also know this material pretty well. I'm like, what the heck are these things? And this colleague of ours goes, oh, that's a candlestick holder. These big candlestick holders. And we're like, are you positive? And so then we got one of these candlestick holders. These things, you can buy these things on eBay. I mean, they're hundreds of years old. But they're huge because these were popular on ships because they wouldn't move back and forth much. And then when folks hit the shore, usually like the officers got first pick, so they're carrying these with them. And they've been used for masses and that kind of thing as well. But man, we took these ones that we have been finding, and we held them up to actual complete capstans. They mapped completely on. And we know from doing these compositional analysis with something called X-ray fluorescence, that of these 20 somewhat fragments we have, that they represent 4 different capstan holders that we have fragments of. What we don't know is why were they breaking these things up? These are scattered in an area about as big as this room right here. I have no concept of why they were doing that. This is a site I'm talking about. So this is like Stark Farms. It looks like there's stuff everywhere. But there's an archaeologist who dug here in 1980, or there in 1980, and his explicit goal was to find Spanish objects. He didn't find any using traditional, and he dug a lot of test units out there. And again, in the course of a couple of days, we found probably, 150 objects or something off this site. Again, metal detecting has allowed us to find the proverbial needle in the haystack. And so, as to kind of wind things up now, I want to say that, I want to emphasize again, we haven't found Labilla, we haven't found Chickasha. We think they're in the neighborhoods. Some people really high to find those sites. I personally am far more interested in material culture. I think what the Native Americans are doing with these things is, this is, if you think about, the American frontier mentality, things that happen on the frontiers where you see hybridity and cultures meshing and coming together and that kind of thing. To me, this is the first instances of those kind of behaviors that are taking place in the Southeast United States. This swapping of cultures and reinventing cultures and that kind of thing. I'm interested in that because I have to say, I'm going to drive this out a little bit, but sometimes you think about why you got interested. I've always been interested in migration and cultures coming together. And one day I thought, maybe it's because I'm an Air Force brat. My dad was in the military, and we were moving all the time. And so my dad's rule of thumb was, 3 moves equal 1 fire. Man, you've lost everything. So I've lost Smashbox cars and clutches and that kind of thing. But I was interested in moving to new places and the things that people do. So in the late 60s, this will age me here, I was like in 6th grade, and my dad got an assignment in Italy. He was using munitions. There's a big Air Force Army base in Tuscany. And when I showed up as a 6th grader, the American kids looked so weird because they had, because the only 10 shoes I was familiar with kids and Converse, but all my the kids I would meet, they're wearing jeans and these weird shoes they called Adidas. These three-striped shoes, the Italians called them Adidas. And it's like, that is the most bizarre looking thing. And I just thought it was almost off-putting in a way. And of course, a year later, I'm wearing the same kind of thing. So yeah, to me, that's a classic mixing and matching what people do on frontiers. And to me, military bases are kind of a frontier setting in a way. So anyway, we haven't found the sites yet, but I like to think we've moved beyond this perspective. A lot of people really want to know where DeSoto was. And to me, yeah, that's interesting and that's important, but that's really the first step in the process. I'm far more interested in what DeSoto was doing, who he was interacting with, how people were reacting to DeSoto, and not just DeSoto, but what were his soldiers doing. Certainly there were illicit economies going on the side that the generals and captains and sergeants wouldn't have approved of. We know that soldiers were sneaking off and coming back, and who knows what was going on. So to me, those are the really interesting things. So now we've moved to a more complex model thanks to some of these finds we're making. It's not only about formal gifts, it's shipwreck salvage that we're seeing in Florida, everyday trade and exchange that the privates and the corporals and so on are doing on the side that I think their bosses don't know about. The Native Americans are scavenging sites like Stark Farms. People are losing tons of stuff in combat. So it's a much more complex and much more interesting and much more realistic model than the one I think we had about 20 or 30 years ago. And like I said, it's revolutionary in a sense because just because it's so new, we don't even know how to make sense of all of this yet. We just started this year a meeting. All of us are working in these different states as a group to try to figure out what's going on. So now we're working with a colleague, Dennis Blanton, who teaches at James Madison University in Virginia, but is from Georgia. He has found what we're positive is Capachecchi, which was DeSoto's first winter camp in 1539, was more or less where Tallahassee is. And the first major province he found to the north with large towns and corn was called Capachecchi, and Dennis is right on top of it. He called people in with metal detectors, we've worked down there, our gang, and yeah, we're finding this stuff again all over the place. So we think the next 5 or 10 years are going to be extremely exciting, but this is a nightmare that we always have in the back of our head, that what have you missed? Anyway, thank you. Also, by the way, I have some of this stuff up here. If you want to wander around, I'll show you what we have, and you want to take a peek at it after people ask questions.
Did the Native Americans have any use of metal before the Europeans?
That's a great question. I should have brought that up. Native Americans had copper. There's a lot of copper that was being traded south in the Great Lakes region, the huge deposits, but the Appalachians have copper deposits also. But they were cold working the copper. So we know when we get like some of those trinkets I showed you, some of those were copper, but some of them are brass. And so because they're smelted metal, we know that this would have to be from Spanish. The one weird exception to the rule there is also that in the Arctic area, there are a lot of meteorite hits, and the predecessors to the modern Inuit and Eskimos, you'll find iron tools. But again, it's cold worked iron. And those are incredibly unusual, but those you have to go as far north as Canada to find those. Going south, the Aztecs and the Incas were definitely far more sophisticated metal workers than you'll see in North America. Like gold.
I had just read the book on Captain Cook
Ah,
going to Hawaii,
right.
and what he had done was the Hawaiians wanted nails,
Ah, right.
so they would trade nail for whatever they needed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought it was really interesting that he was.
So here's something interesting. When we know, if you saw some of those numbers with the 68,000 nails intact, we find nails sometimes. And you think you would find nails a lot. We have a lot of discussions like over wine and beer. That's where some of our great ideas. And one night we were discussing why do we find so few nails, relatively speaking. And we think of, when we thought about it, we're like, it's got to be one of the most important items you're carrying with you if you're traveling across the landscape. Because one of the things you see that involve most of the arduous task is crossing rivers. So they build boats and they float them across. Sometimes they're attached to chains and they're pulling them across. And we think what they're doing is they get the boats to the other side, they burn the wood, recover the nails, and keep moving again. So Native Americans were definitely interested in nails. But if you look to the very end of the DeSoto expedition in 1543, when, man, they've got almost nothing left, they still have nails. They're making boats to float down the Mississippi River. That's the one thing that they're hanging on to.
Did the Spaniards have blacksmiths that the Indigenous observed? And then did they work iron at all later by using heat?
The Spaniards?
No,
Not the Indians. Not the Indians. But, you know, the Spaniards refer to having anvils, and I always wondered what that would be like, because we all know what an anvil looks like. And I had this vision like 4 people carrying a litter with an anvil. But when I got to the museum about 10 years ago, and I was talking to a colleague about that, I goes, no, they're portable anvils. I was like, what are you talking about? Somewhere around Tallahassee, archaeologists found a portable anvil off of a mission site, and they're still heavy. They're about that big, about that wide, and they have a point in the bottom so you can drive them into a piece of wood. So the Spaniards were definitely forging on the fly, but there's no evidence that Native Americans ever picked up that skill until like the 1700s or so.
none of the artifacts you found that showed that the Indigenous had actually worked them.
No. You're only breaking things apart, yeah.
How deep were these metal objects buried?
Another great question. One of the concerns we have as an archaeologist is I don't want to pull an artifact, if I haven't dug again with a lot of documentation, I don't want to pull a deep artifact that's out of the pits that a Native American had or a burial context or whatever. So we restrict ourselves to plow zone. So we don't really go any deeper than that, so, on purpose. Because anything below the plow zone is undisturbed, and we don't want to remove stuff from undisturbed context.
Okay, you had a slide there, and you were talking about a lot of the artifacts are just kind of scattered around. I can envision, if DeSoto's under attack, and they don't know about it, they're in full retreat, and they're just running for their lives and stuff flying off of the wagons and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So I kind of, and you said that stuff was just scattered over,
Exactly. And to follow up with that, because we have so few sites to do comparative work yet, this is also new, we're not sure how meaningful some of the patterns are, but one we're seeing is, I think follows kind of what you're talking about, that scatter syndrome. At Stark Farms in Mississippi, we have a lot of axes, or axe fragments, the formal ones that I showed you in Spanish, and only about like 2 or 3 horseshoe fragments. In Alabama, we haven't found any axes. We found a lot of horseshoe fragments. I wondered what if you just left a bucket behind as you're running?
Yeah.
Somebody picks up that bucket of horseshoes, got lucky in Alabama. So I think there may be a lot of just circumstance that dictates what we're finding on these sites. But again, our sample sites are so small, we're not sure how to make sense of these patterns yet.
Does the population both, you talked about Mississippi and Arkansas, it's not like Florida where there's been massive overdevelopment. That's going to affect all these archaeological digs.
That is true. That's very true. So a lot of stuff in Florida, you saw those expeditions going on, hitting Tampa, going north of Tampa. There's going to be nothing left of those since those are on the coastline. But a colleague of mine is going to have some of us come out to Arkansas next year to look for the DeSoto west of the Mississippi River. And I'm from Eastern Arkansas, my mom's family is. It's nothing. It's just all, soybean and cotton and that kind of thing. So it's like you said.
It's very agricultural, so.
Exactly, the whole eastern half of the state.
In the northeast or parts of the Midwest where it's been very heavily populated.
Right.
That changes how archaeologists are going to be able to do digs.
Exactly.
Like in the deserts in Arizona or Utah, whatever, that's a little different.
And I have to say that the landowners are incredibly gracious and interested in this kind of thing. And DeSoto has a certain cachet. If you say you're looking for DeSoto, everybody has family stories about how they heard DeSoto had passed through there and that kind of thing. So it's
Good question. Are you doing any sites, say, in this region with your metal detectors? especially this island that had a large Spanish presence at one time.
Right. I haven't. People may have. There are other Spanish missions that have been excavated. I'm not sure exactly. Just people know exactly where they were. Santa Catalina de Iguale.
There was supposedly one down on the south end of the island.
Okay, maybe that's where they were.
Dorian Diggs, that was on the south end of town.
I will say though, now that you brought it up, that if you look at the history of mission research in Florida, people have brought out metal detectors, but you can tell by the way they're describing it that we're just kind of walking around to see what they can find. It's like 20 or 30 years ago. So they'll find maybe 8 or 10 objects and go nails and they go, there's probably a building here. That's all they did.
Right.
So this year we're working on a mission site on the north side of Gainesville. It was founded in 1606. And we're going to take this approach. We're going to be the first people to systematically metal detect an entire mission site. We have hundreds of nails. I can tell you, I can show you maps. I'm pretty sure exactly where the different Spanish buildings were on this mission site. So there's lots to gain by doing that sort of thing, but it hasn't been done a whole lot.
I'm just knowing that I live down at the plantation, and across the street from me, there's alleged there was a Spanish mission that was located at one time.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And it's just a large lawn area right now.
This was, as y'all know, this was a hotbed in the 1600s in particular. Native Americans and Spaniards. Incredibly rich area. Pirates, all kinds of stuff.
Well, Fernandina was one of the largest ports importing slaves.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Across the
When
border.
did that start?
Go to Old Town and look at the field there and read the monuments they have out there.
Is that like in the 1700s?
1700 was one of the major imports of slave trade right
You
now.
don't know that.
It's not from the
Early
early
1800s.
Right.
Especially when slavery was outlawed in the colonies. And
Oh, okay.
Florida was still Spanish.
Right,
And
right.
so it was a place to bring African Americans in and sell them further.
Understood. Right. Wow.
So I have a totally irrelevant question.
I have an irrelevant.
Unless someone has a relevant question. But so there's a story before DeSoto, that there was an expedition and a lot of the Spaniards had gotten wiped out, but there was a particular young man that was captured, I think it might have been by the Crusoe or further north, and he lived, saved by the chief's daughter and all that kind of stuff. But he lived for, I think, 20 years.
Esteban.
Yeah, and then DeSoto's men found him and he traveled with it.
That's a true story.
I
Yeah.
thought so. So which on that map of all the expeditions, are any of those the ones where he got
Esteban was captured somewhere in central Florida. I think he was a shipwreck survivor. He managed to get to shore, and he was taken in by Native American groups. And so DeSoto, to his surprise, found a Spaniard who spoke not only Spanish, I forgot how long he lived here, for years, but he also spoke several native languages fluently. So DeSoto reappropriated him into Spanish culture, and he was the first kind of translator for DeSoto. So he was an important character in the DeSoto expedition. There are a couple of cases of things like that happened.
What was his name?
Esteban, yes. But there's one of the accounts in the DeSoto book, I can't remember, it's so interesting that imagine trying to, again, first contact, completely mutually unintelligible languages. You're talking at one point, they have like 4 or 5 Native American translators that they've picked up along the way, where A says to B, says to D, says to E, speaks to this one who also speaks Spanish. And so it's like that telephone game. You wonder what gets lost in translation and what have you. But yeah,